Technology here just recently, legislatively and through the administration, has been elevated to a kind of national security level, and I think that is important just because it touches so many things. And when people think about biotechnology, I think a lot of their mind goes directly to healthcare, but it's well beyond healthcare. It's agricultural. It's really the fuels that we make, and so biotechnology encompasses really. It does definitely encompass healthcare, but encompasses all things that we can make out of biology that's not just related to healthcare. Because there's fuels, medicines, new materials, all of that's very important. And what happens, it becomes an issue of not only national security, but national resilience, in that we have to, if we want to continue to grow and be the leader in the world in these things, we have to be able to make these things at scale on our own. Otherwise, we're captive to the countries that may or may not want to sell us these types of things.
Welcome to the Additive Advantage podcast, where we cut through the hype to talk about what it really takes to turn additive manufacturing into real business results. I'm Dani Mason, joined by my co-host Shon Anderson. Together, we bring decades of experience in technology and additive manufacturing to explore how organizations move from pilot projects to scalable, performance-driven capabilities. Let's get started.
Today's episode is about something bigger than biotechnology. It's about national resilience. This is round 2 in our Made in America series. Interestingly, even with biotechnology, it turns out to be a lot about manufacturing discipline. And it's also about what happens when we treat biology not as a science experiment, but as a production system. We're joined in this episode by Tom Jantsch from Ronawk. He's going to explain why biotechnology is a national security issue and how additive manufacturing can be a part of the solution. I'm excited about today. We've got a guest that brings a very unique perspective on what the United States manufacturing capabilities are and could be. And from a view sitting in the biotech slice of the pie, Tom Jantsch, welcome to the program, and looking forward to what our folks can learn from you today. Do you want to share a little bit about your background with our audience so that they understand where your expertise lies?
Sure. Again, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to participate today, and as always, appreciate your insight and what you bring to additive manufacturing. I'm a CPA by background and training, and I've spent all of my career in operations and finance. A little bit different in that for the last 25 years, have spent that time in a variety of startup companies. And I like the what I call organized chaos of that, and some people either like it or not. But also the thought behind just building something from scratch, from the ground up, is really what gets me excited, and I very much like that. And so, again, I've been in a lot of different things. This particular endeavor, I think, is exciting for where we are in the world today, and where the States sits, and in particular as it relates to national security. So I'm excited to talk about this topic because it's near and dear to my heart.
Well, thank you again for joining us, Tom. And I think the folks that listen to this program will really identify with a few things you just said. Number one, you're passionate about building things from scratch. And whether it's biotech or a more traditional additive manufacturing application, there's a lot of folks that can't tolerate the chaos that comes early in that stage. But we'll get more into that in a minute. I'd love for you to start, Tom, as you and I've gotten to know each other as B9 Creations and your company Ronawk have worked together. I've heard you say a number of times that, biotechnology is a matter of national security. What do you mean by that? And why do you say that?
Well, it is important, and I think, and again, next generation biotechnology actually holds more promise to directly and profoundly enhance human life, and represents the next era of innovation, American innovation. And so really, when you think about that, and hot topics today in the world are quantum computing, AI, and then now biotechnology. And biotechnology here just recently, legislatively and through the administration, has been elevated to a kind of national security level. And I think that is important just because it touches so many things. And when people think about biotechnology, I think a lot of their mind goes directly to healthcare, but it's well beyond healthcare. It's agricultural. It's really the fuels that we make. And so biotechnology encompasses really, it does definitely encompass healthcare, but encompasses all things that we can make out of biology that's not just related to healthcare. Because there's fuels, medicines, new materials, all of that's very important. And what happens, it becomes an issue of not only national security, but national resilience, in that we have to, if we want to continue to grow and be the leader in the world in these things, we have to be able to make these things at scale on our own. Otherwise, we're captive to the countries that may or may not want to sell us these types of things. And so I think it's very important that we become self-sufficient. And then, as I say, biotechnology, I think, is going to be the forefront of leading the charge because it impacts so many things.
Well, and you rattle off a great list there. I'm one of those people that until I got exposed to more of our biotech customer base here at B9, I'll admit I was pretty naive about, when you say things like fuel, okay, medicines, healthcare, yep, we all get that. But some of the other things on your list that biotech plays into that I think for the average person walking around on the streets, even the average engineer in my case, we're not aware of the tie-in. And you mentioned things that are all things we normally consume. What about things that potentially would get unleashed on us that we don't normally consume or want unleashed on us? And how does, because when we say national security, I think that's where a lot of people's minds go. I mean, how does biotech play into that? What does that look like?
Well, I think what's important, and I maybe touched on it a little bit, but I can expand, and I'll focus a little bit on the pharma industry to start, but it applies to agriculture, and it applies to, say, fuels as well, next generation fuels as well, or next generation materials. We as a country want to be self-sufficient. We want to be stable. And so in the pharma industry today, the United States currently does a lot of the R&D, not all the R&D, but then all the manufacturing gets shipped overseas. And then you have a pandemic, and hopefully we never have another one of those. And all of a sudden we become literally hostages to that manufacturing from those other countries because we don't manufacture onshore here. And so there's been a lot of talk about onshoring our biotechnology manufacturing capability. But again, it comes back to, we need to go on. We want to be able to be on the forefront of setting the standards for what happens. We want to be able to make it such that we're not can get anybody's control or some country or adversary that we don't want. And again, by setting the standards, people think that there's a lot of good that could be done with biology. There's a lot of good, but there's also maybe some bad that could be done with it. By being the leader and setting the standards, we'll have some say in the control of what happens and be able to direct it more towards the good.
Talk to me a little bit about when you think biotechnology as a national security interest. I'm guessing you've just touched on a couple of them, but what would be the things that you would say if we want a robust position around biotech? What would be 3 or 4 or 5 of the pillars that we have to say that we have national resilience in that area?
Well, first and foremost, we've got to onshore the manufacturing of the biotechnology here. And again, but that's a multi-step thing because so if we look at the legacy technology and what's happening, kind of the thought is we tend to want to build cathedrals. We want to build very large plants. But what happens in biotech is that that becomes a single-use, single-purpose plant, and it's costly and it's timely. And some of that's driven by the legacy technologies that they use. And if you ask somebody why you do something a certain way, that you get the same answer, and this is in any industry, it's because that's the way it's always been done. But biotechnology, all of biotechnology, it doesn't matter whether it's healthcare, fuels, materials, agriculture, is all stuck in the same spot. And they can't produce the right type of cell, and they certainly can't produce it can't scale it at anything that makes economic sense. And that's the starting point. We can't produce the right cell, and we can't produce it an economy that makes sense. And so part of the problem is, and you can stop me if I'm going too far here, but
You're doing great.
the starting point is, today, when we think about scaling biotech, it's, we do it the same way. They're making medicine today or trying to make therapeutics today in the same way they make beer. So in a big stir tank bioreactor, we can scale up bacteria, we can scale up yeast, and we're pretty good at that. And those types of cells, those types of organisms like that. Again, they're unicellular. They scale linearly. And so if you just add more volume, that's what they like. But mammalian cells in particular, so kind of coming back to the healthcare, starting with that, when we think about the next generation therapeutics, there are no 2D cells in your body. There's nothing as flat, as hard as a Petri dish in your body. So mammalian cells in particular, they're about community. They're all about the environment. And so you've got to scale them up in an environment that makes sense, or where they can grow naturally and think that they're actually inside the body when they're actually outside the body. And so it really comes down to that very foundational beginning part. What's the environment that you're starting with? And so when I think about the biggest thing that could happen is, and I talked about these cathedrals, it's probably a hybrid as opposed to just any one thing. So you may still want a large plant, but what you really need to be able to do is have a series of modular smaller plants that can turn over quickly, that can meet surge capacity. But if you use the legacy technologies, they're really not, it doesn't apply. It's hard to do that. And so they take up a lot of physical space. It takes years to actually build the plant together. So really think about it, approach it from a fundamentally different way. And the approach is really, instead of using the legacy technology, approach it from a microbe era start, physics and chemistry. You got to approach it from a mammalian biology. So from a biology's perspective. And when you do that, what you'll find is that you're going to shrink the footprint. You're going to be able to build these modular sites. They're going to be able to change very quickly. And so, again, surge capacity, the ability to change, to meet demand, to geographically disperse, again, from a national security standpoint is important. And so it's not just one big plant. It's a series of very small modular plants that are dispersed geographically that are then kind of honoring biology and approaching it from a biology first perspective, and therefore much, much more efficient, capital efficient.
Got it. Well, so much of what you're saying, Tom, when you talk about, surge capacity, supply chain, distributed manufacturing, I mean, this all starts to sound like additive manufacturing, and maybe that's why we had you on. Before we get into the additive manufacturing specific side of it, though, you mentioned things, you talk about onshoring the capacity. You talk about standards, and one of the things you've shared with me that was a little bit of a mind blower that ties right in here is you said, Shon, there aren't consistent methodologies to grow cells. And when, just a moment ago, you shared that that's really where, whether you're developing a new therapeutic, you're testing an existing or, potential new drug, if we don't have standard processes around that cell biology, it's very difficult to predict future outcomes when we don't have standardized processes. So, what do you mean when you say there aren't consistent methodologies around that? Because I'm guessing a lot of our audience just assumes that before a drug company unleashes a drug on people, they've run some test 1,000,000 times and got the same result 999,999 times. But peel back the curtain and shatter our illusions of how that works.
The state of the art today is very craft driven. It is not process driven. It is not standardized. And so when you try to grow a cell in one lab and then you try to grow that same cell, it could be the exact same cell in another lab, you most likely are going to get completely different results. And so that's the starting point. And again, some of that is, you're going to hear me use this word quite a bit, but it's the starting environment. And so when you can, and we'll get into the additive because the environment starts with a 3D printed hydrogel substrate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's this environment that allows cells to communicate and react outside the body in the same manner that they do inside the body. So that's the starting point. The second point, which makes it really hard if you think about kind of how they scale up. So everybody starts in the same dish, and then they go to a little bit bigger dish. Then maybe they'll go to a series of stacked up dishes, and then what's called a hollow fiber tube, and then eventually the stir tank bioreactor that we talked about. Part of the problem is that environment in each one of the scale up phases is completely different than the previous one. And then therefore, they have to completely revalidate the entire process from start to finish every single time they scale up. And there's about 4 or 5 steps in the scaling up process. Every time they scale up, it's a different product and they have to revalidate it. And so it's really a matter of, and that's not the way biology operates. And so if you can, again, put it in an environment that's more natural, you compress the time frame considerably, and then you provide much more consistency and repeatability to the process. What I want to be clear about is we don't, and no one will ever standardize biology. Biology is going to be biology, and that's the point. You want to let it be biology as opposed to take it out of the natural state, but you have to standardize the process, the environment, and the processes around that biology so that you can gain some consistency, and so that when you see differences, you're able to measure it, and you're able to actually realize that there is a difference. And again, that's manufacturing 101, quite honestly, I think.
Yeah, agree. And, I think there's probably a lot of manufacturing folks that are going to listen to this and that are going to say, well, wait a minute, you mean I couldn't run the same process in this plant that I ran in that plant and get the same results? Well, we'd never released that product, except that's the reality that, and to your point, it's not a sloppiness of process. It's a limitation of tool set. And we'll get into that tool set in a second, but you use the phrase, you can't standardize biology. You got to let biology be biology. So then what would, I'll call it production scale, QA/QC look like for living systems? How would you approach that to try to make this predictable and repeatable?
So I think, again, it all starts with the beginning environment. And like I say, all of biotechnology, I think maybe I already said this, is kind of stuck in the same spot. They can't produce the right type of cell and they can't produce it at scale. So part of the inconsistency comes from because they have to change the type of substrate that they're in. And so that's what brings a lot of inconsistency to this process. And so what they haven't figured out yet today, and what we think we bring to the table, is this ability to create an environment that is more natural. We honor biology and we let biology be biology. A lot of times you'll see biology, they'll go in and they'll have a preconceived consumption idea about what that biology is going to do. And when it doesn't do it, they'll change their thesis. But what you really want to do is put it in an environment and just say, what's going to happen? Let's see what's going to happen. And then when I talked about this ability to scale up in the same substrate from the bench all the way to scaling, that's where you really bring some consistency. Now, what you have to add to that is then, again, manufacturing on a run. What are the processes? What are the rules? How are you going to measure things? How are you going to do the QA, QC along the way? And again, how are you going to document things on the back end? And so one of the uses, and I think this will make a lot of sense for people, there's a lot of talk about AI and AI for biology and how great that will be. Well, quite honestly, there's a lot of biological data available, but that data is very disparate. It's all different. If I go to lab A and then go to lab B, I'm going to get, again, same cell type, but different data set. Biology doesn't need AI. AI needs standardized biology. Again, it all kind of comes down to the starting point, and it's the environment that they start in, and again, keeping them in that environment, and then doing all the manufacturing 101 measurements, standards, rules, processes. It's not a hard thing. It's just it's a little bit change in mindset from the way they do it.
Understood. And I suspect that everybody who's going to consume this content is going to be amening everything you just said, and probably didn't have an appreciation for how hard that is in biotech. Give us a couple of minutes, Tom, on the kind of breakthrough that Ronawk had about how we can start to standardize this, and then we'll move into what that allows us to do from there.
Like a lot of things, and there's an old saying, and I don't know who to attribute it to, but necessity is the mother of invention. And so the founder, Dr. A.J. Malott, in his PhD had to grow billions of cells for what he was working on. And as he was going through that process, and it's, as you can imagine, or might imagine, if you've ever done this before, you'll certainly understand how tedious the legacy process is of doing that. Tedious, it's prone with the potential for contamination. And as I said before, it's a completely unnatural environment for the cells. There's nothing as hard or as flat in your body as plastic, cultured plasticware, and there are no 2D cells in your body. And so as he's going through this process, and you have a lot of time sitting in a lab waiting for things to happen, he says, there just has to be a better way to do this. And so I got to grow billions of cells. This is a terrible way I'm going to do it. So let's think about another way to do it. And so what he conceived of was how, got to think, how do cells grow in the body? How do cells interact with each other? And again, the conclusion is just that. When I talked about microbes, yeast and bacteria, they're unicellular. They're okay floating around on themselves. Actually, they like that. That's what they do. But mammalian cells they're about organization. They're about community. And so the environment they're in matters greatly. And so the product that he conceived of is a 3D printed hydrogel substrate that really looks like a Lego piece, and there's reasons for that. But within this macro structure of that piece are all these channels. There's a micro structure within that. And really the whole goal was to replicate or create an environment that would allow cells to replicate and thrive outside the body in the same manner that they do inside the body. Now, for a non-scientist, and I am a non-scientist, and I'm not constrained by this is the way it's always been done, it's extremely common sense. Wait a minute, if I can create an environment that would allow cells to grow outside the body, why wouldn't everybody do that? And again, we're making some traction along those lines, and it does make sense, but it's not the way it's been done, which is kind of interesting, I think. Again, I got to grow a whole bunch of stuff. I don't like to do it the way I'm doing it. Let's find a better way. Necessity is the mother of invention. I think that's the best way to create something new, quite honestly.
So maybe give our audience a little bit of background about, you kind of shared there's a macro and a micro element to this 3D printed construct. What's associated with, can you just spit this stuff out by the truckload, or how do you make this? And how do you apply some of the lessons you're talking about around standardization, QA, QC, et cetera? How has that come to life internally with what you guys are doing at Ronawk?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that when we start to explain and even show a physical example of what we call bioblocks to somebody, they'll look at that and really the very first thing out, well, how hard can that be? And with a lot of processes and a lot of things that you see, it's much harder than you think. And so when I think about not only additive manufacturing, but just processes in general, it actually starts from the very beginning. And so in this journey, what we found is, all right, AJ has conceived of a 3D printed hydrogel substrate. All right, well, we're going to go buy some BioInk and we're going to just start printing this thing. And oh, wait a minute, we can't find BioInk on the market today that is repeatable, consistent, actually does what we need it to do. And the first printer we bought really doesn't stay within the parameters that we need, and it's not consistent. Again, it drifts from different things, and so all of a sudden we're faced with all the same things that we've been talking about here. You've got to tighten up the controls and the standards, and so it forced us to create our own BioInk. Actually, from scratch, we were able to do that completely. So supply chain for that is completely within the United States. We were fortunate to run into B9 Creations and buy the printer that we needed to actually be able to then pair up with and make it match with the ink. And so so now all of a sudden, I talk about this environment, but part of creating this environment is you got to have all the processes and the standards around to create the ink, to actually be able to print the BioBlock itself on a consistent basis, so that when you ship a block, or what we call actually along with the block, it's a BioOS, or a biological operating system. It's a complete package with several layers, and we talk about the environment, which is the physical layer, the block, the processes, and then the controls, and then the cells become what we call the wetware. But all of that starts in the very beginning from the ink and the block itself. And so it's not just I'm applying it all consistently, and I'm also now applying it consistently to a very consistent substrate, and the ink is consistent as well. And so all of those things come together all at once. I hope I answered your question there.
Yeah, that was a great job. I mean, I think what is so true, regardless of the additive manufacturing application, is you have to have this foundation of repeatability, right? Whether that's the material. I mean, we deal with this a lot. We have customers that I jokingly, say that we break a lot of hearts, where we have a customer that says, "Hey, I need to make 10 million of this thing, and here I found a material that I think I can do that in." The problem is the people making this material are doing it in a 55-gallon drum with a guy that's got a big veterinary glove on, stirring it with his hand. And I'm like, that is not the supply base that you need to get the kind of repeatability that you and your end customers want out of this product. And I think one of the other things we're proving here is that an engineer and a CPA can get along. But the CPA's recognition that, hey, if we don't have this foundation of repeatability, we can't build anything and scale.
And the key there is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Oh, go ahead.
it's at scale. So there's a lot of people building onesie twosies. That doesn't mean you can build it at scale. It is a completely different thing, and that is definitely true for biotechnology. And that's a little bit of the disconnect in the industry today. I'm a researcher, and I've built one thing. Isn't this great? But when they start to talk about the process, and every time you scale up, you get, the margins. I'm trying to think of an example here, but your margin for error just kind of increases, and so you've got to have it so tight. You also have to have given some thought to scalability before you manufacture the one. And there's a very huge disconnect and silos between R&D and biotech today and the actual manufacturing of that. And so part of what our technology does is kind of say, look, we're thinking about that from the start, but we're going to grow with you from the bench all the way up to scaling, as opposed to here it is, now go figure out how to manufacture it.
When you think of biotech as a national security initiative, what role do you see additive manufacturing playing in the U.S.'s kind of national resilience or competitiveness in this area?
Well, I think the big thing is, and you touched upon it, and I think it's really, really important. It's really a mindset. And so I'm not creating one-offs. My goal is not to create one-offs. It is to create a system that is repeatable, that is modular, that is portable. And again, additive manufacturing, it's the only way it works. That's the way you have to think about things. And so, and again, we're not standardizing biology, but all the processes and all the steps around biology, biotech, it's so important to have that mindset. And that's what we kind of need to bring to the industry as a whole. One of the great things about this, some we meet resistance and some we don't. But what I would say is, you've got a PhD, you've studied your whole life, and you want to find a cure for whatever. Additive manufacturing, these processes that we bring, are going to relieve you of the very mundane things that you have to do on a daily basis to get to where you want to go. And guess what? You get to focus on your thinking on how is this really working? The form factor of this technology allows you to see living systems, living biology for the first time ever. And so let's put that brain power and all that knowledge and all that learning to figuring out the problems, as opposed to I've got to go scrape the cells out of the dish and go from 2 to 4 to 8, and you don't have to do that anymore. And so we're going to automate a lot of that process. And so it doesn't do away with jobs. It just makes, my personal opinion, it makes the job much more interesting and more fun, because we're going to take away the mundane task, and we're going to allow you to apply all that knowledge that you went to school to learn in a much better fashion.
Makes sense. When in our experience, and I'll speak outside of biotech, but when we've built a process for a customer that goes from providing them some tools to analyze and validate consistency of materials to kind of that file design layout, I'll call it the pre-printing process, the printing process, post-processing of the part, whether that's a cleaning, post-curing, whatever that might be, post-finishing, and then all the downstream steps of, well, that part might get shipped somewhere before it gets loaded into a Kanban and then put on a manufacturing floor. Whenever something changes and quits working, usually the reaction is, well, it must be at the printer. Well, that's actually the least human, least varying part of everything I just said. I understand why people might jump to that conclusion, but it's usually not the printer that changed the most when you have all these human based steps involved. What's the equivalent of that on the biology side?
Yeah, it's extremely similar, and quite honestly, for us, and you'll see this all the time. It's never the cell. A scientist, and well, I didn't get the result I wanted. There must have been something wrong with the cell. It couldn't have been the environment, the process, all these types of things that you just talked about. You've got to lock those down, because if you do 3 experiments and you get 3 different results, you have no idea what really changed, or what it was, because you didn't do the same thing over again. Now, they'd like to say they did, but and again, I'm trying not to bash on scientists, although it really sounds about it. All we're trying to do, and it's just the same, I think, for what you're saying, is give them a playbook that allows them to more easily replicate time and time again. It's process discipline, it's consistency. That's what you have to bring to it, so that when there is a change, you've got some things. You can do a root cause analysis. You can actually decide what happened, and it is too easy to blame the cell. Or in your case, it's too easy to blame the printer, but it's the exact same thing. And so it's all about discipline, process discipline. It's all about consistency. In that fashion, it's the exact same thing, because we hear the same kind of excuses. And so it's not that if you follow the same process and you're able to actually document that and quantify that, that's your only chance for figuring out what really went wrong, why it was different. And in some cases, it's a good thing. We just went through an experiment with a client this week, and we're doing a pilot, and we actually got a result that we weren't expecting, and they weren't expecting. But it was like, holy cow, this is a whole new product that we can come up with. But we're now able to say, you got this result that was unexpected because of this, this, and this, not because, oh, well, this cell must just have been different. It wasn't. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could lead to good things, but you have to have the background and the process discipline to be able to identify what exactly happened, so that you can determine whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when we work with customers who, there's always this scale up problem. Even if it's an existing product and you sell 1 million of them, if you're not doing it with additive, you got to start with some kind of pilot. And we've developed this whole, pilot to scale process where, yes, we do start with a pilot. And then you don't, just because it worked once doesn't mean we go straight, buy 1,000 printers and start running them 24/7. But the learnings that come from that, once you start to get the big rocks ironed out and you're getting into how do we make sure the incoming material is consistent? It starts to sound like a regular boring manufacturing process. And that's kind of what I'm hearing you say, Tom, is if you can get this to sound like and I just offended all the manufacturing engineers and I apologize, but if you can get it to sound like, hey, this isn't some new novel thing. Frankly, if we just do these 12 things the same way every time, this is going to work like a champ. How do we make biology boring in that sense? Because I feel like we got to get it there to be able to scale it the way you're describing.
And again, it depends on how you kind of take boring. And so a company's goal ought to be, as it relates to biology, is to do just that, boring. And again, maybe that seems like it has a negative connotation, but in this particular case, it is absolutely positive. I need to make it boring by standardizing the environment, standardizing the processes, standardizing the reporting associated with this, so that I can tell what's really happening. I think anybody that's in manufacturing, and again, it's really, maybe we need to come up with a better term for it, as opposed to boring. But when I take all of that out of it, I get to focus my brain power on what I believe are the more interesting things. What is the discovery? What can I really do with this? What am I seeing in this cell, as opposed to, did I do this right or this wrong? I got a different result this time. And so boring is good. I'll absolutely say boring is good, and it really needs to be that way. And again, it's just consistency and process control. And so that ought to be a goal of everybody in biology.
Well, I think it's sometimes a revelation, that how do you translate something from R&D to production? And oftentimes I think another word for boring is just predictable,
Right.
right? But you shouldn't be doing anything in production if it's not predictable. You're just creating a pile of scrap or rework or whatever term you want to use. I want to shift gears a little bit here because for those of you who hadn't heard of Ronawk before, Tom, and he shared a little bit about AJ, one of the founders. I mean, this company is working on changing the world as it relates to biotech and medicine. You guys are doing some really hard work, and I want to get into we've had a variety of guests on this show already, and yep, there's a technology piece, there's process, there's all this stuff. But at the end of the day, the human element of creating a high performance organization that's required to do this kind of work, because, global problems tend to not get solved by underperforming, poorly constructed teams. I'd love to hear your perspective, Tom, as the COO of that organization. You guys are working on changing the world. What does it take to lead that organization and keep that very technical team aligned to tackle a problem that big? How do you go about doing that?
Well, first and foremost, it's focus. It's what are we trying to achieve, and why are we trying to achieve this? And everybody on the team needs to understand the scorecard. What are we being measured against? And I think that's very important. Engineers, I'll take my crack at engineer, because there's engineering jokes and there's accountant jokes. The last 10% of a project is maybe the hardest thing to get across the board. And so, big ideas die in complexity. So keep it simple. And it's really also easy to celebrate interesting, but we want to celebrate repeatable. So, and that one of the things I will say, I challenge the scientists on this kind of daily is, okay, that's an interesting find, great, all right, but we're not trying to look for interesting. Let's find something we can repeat and we can productize. All right, that's the business side. And so, and then when we get done with the process, where we talk to a customer, very, very honest, what went right, what went wrong, that post-mortem evaluation, root cause analysis is really important. But I think, really understanding what we're trying to achieve, and just it becomes the theme, the mantra. Everybody's got to be rowing the boat in the same direction is so important. And then I would say we're a small team today. We're 15 people. And so we're still at that point where everybody's a believer. Everybody believes in this mission. And again, it's harder to do as a company gets really, really large. But I think that's one of our advantages, and it makes the job a little bit easier and more interesting. Everybody's here because they want to be here. They believe in this mission. They want to create a new therapeutic. It's interesting science for them, or for our scientists. Again, on a call yesterday, one of our newest PhDs said, well, I came in, I thought this was interesting, and now I'm never going back to the old way. This is so much better and so much easier, and I am so happy to be working on this. And so I think it's, again, the execution just comes down to what are we trying to achieve and why. And so I think it's really important from a culture standpoint that every company has a culture, whether they know it or not, and some are more formalized than others, but it really comes from the top, always. There's no doubt about it. And so I'm very proud to work with our founders, AJ and Heather, and that's really important. And they do set that tone, and everybody sees that.
You guys have a great team there, and we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about how to take, I'll use your word, how to take something interesting and then make it boring. How do you get a bunch of scientists and R&D people to get excited, who tend to get rewarded and recognized for finding the interesting, and get them excited about making it repeatable and predictable?
That's a great question. And actually, it is a little bit of a challenge because coming out of school in particular, they're not taught that. You think maybe they would be, but they're absolutely not. And they are taught to go find something interesting. And so you can see it happen here, and it takes a little bit of time. They start it, hey, this is interesting, it's great. Then you start asking some questions, and I hadn't thought about this or I hadn't thought about that, and then they go back, and then they come back. So about the third or fourth time, they finally, they know what you're going to ask again, and again, it's a little bit of coaching, it's a little bit of mentoring, but it is a changing of their mindset to say, look, we're not in academia, we're in industry, results matter, and so that's what you got to be focused on. Now, not everybody makes the cut in that way. Some people can't change. They just only want to find interesting. And so it's important to find those people that understand that difference and the importance of that difference. We're not looking for interesting, we're looking for results.
And obviously you've got two founders in AJ and Heather who, we by the nature of what we do, we get involved with a lot of, I'll call them early stage tech or biotech companies, med device companies. The two of them to go from researchers, Heather was a microscopist, you're looking at all this like first time trying to spot these cool things. How have the three of you, clearly they were making a mindset shift when they said, hey, we need to bring in a guy who has helped grow and scale businesses in this space. How do the three of you work through that in a way that then enables you to translate that to the rest of the team?
Another good question. I think it's important for anybody who is a founder who's thinking about starting a company is, and everybody's guilty of this, you fall in love with your product, your idea, you fall in love with it, and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And you have to think that, otherwise you won't go through all the pain and suffering to try to bring it to market. But I think I will give both AJ and Heather credit. First and foremost, this recognition that they need a diversity of thought. And if you know AJ and Heather, what you come to realize, and this is a good thing, not a bad thing, they are completely different. They're I don't know which is what. One's right, left, one's right brain, and the other one's left brain. I don't know which is which. And so, and that turns out to be a very complimentary. AJ's the idea thing though, back of the napkin, and Heather then operationalizes it. Nope, I got to have detail 1 through 10 down, and this is what makes sense. But they go back and forth on that. And then I think what they recognized, and I don't think they give themselves enough credit, but it is important because they have other things that they need to do. Let's bring somebody in that has a finance background. That's another important aspect of it. And what I get to do, quite honestly, and they let me do it, is play scientist, CPA scientist, and challenge them. But again, I'll bring up things that are like, well, we hadn't thought about that, and no scientist would think of that because of the bias that they have from their training. And so when you bring in completely different perspectives, I think that's one of the most important things. In my career and hiring people and trying to be hired, I've run across this, well, we got to have someone with, only this industry experience. And I think you have to have some of that, but it's actually a very limiting thing to a company. You want to bring in people, one, based on, are they a good fit for the organization and company, but you want to bring them back in because they bring a different perspective, because they'll give you ideas that you've never seen before, as opposed to just being trapped. And so I think it's just a recognition, and AJ and Heather both would say that they were in academia, they got frustrated by let's just, get the next grant. We don't actually care to actually productize anything or commercialize anything. We're incentivized to write a grant. That's all we are. And so, no, you know what? This is a technology that can help people. We can do big things. Let's go do that. And I think companies then have to realize it takes more than those two founders. It's going to take a team to do it. And again, but don't go out and hire yourself or just a clone of yourself. Go out and hire different people that bring a different mindset, a different set of experiences. And sometimes we use AJ's advice. Sometimes we use Heather's, and every great once in a while they use mine. But you just got to have that diversity of thought.
Yeah, there's so much power there. And then when you have technical professionals who understand the importance of the rest of the team being on board and bought in, that's where the magic can start to happen. A lot of times you get the technical professional that shows you the result on the paper and says, well, you should be bought in because A plus B equals C. See? Well, if you're the inventor of that, nobody else is going to love A plus B equals C as much as you, right? So you're going to have to figure out how they're wired and what their God-given gifts and talents are to figure out how do we get them to see themselves in our joint success. And again, we get approached by a lot of companies. We choose not to work with a ton of them because oftentimes what we can see is that this company is not likely to succeed. We're the judge of the technology, but of course we also look at the team, we look at their vision, we look at their execution capability. And there are times we've turned down projects that folks were willing to pay us to do because we're not a consulting firm. We don't want to work on a project if it's not going to go somewhere. And we invest our time and energy and resources in things that we believe have the opportunity to go somewhere and actually scale from an additive or hybrid or advanced manufacturing perspective. It's one of the things we were excited about with Ronawk is so much of what B9 has just beaten the drum on. And you'd be surprised, even in the manufacturing world, something like, and I use this example all the time. I don't mean for it to get tired, but to me, it's so basic that it's the most stark example I can give. When you say, well, can a company give you a certificate of conformance for their printer? If they can't, how would you ever build a scalable, repeatable process around that piece of equipment? There's no other, if you walk into a manufacturing plant and said, hey, this mill or this injection molding press or this, blow molding machine, whatever it is, like what are its operating parameters? So if we bought a second one, we would know they would perform the same. Somebody could pull out a sheet from the manufacturer that would say, well, it operates within these pressures and it has such and such resolution of the speeds and the feeds, blah, blah, blah. 3D printing, to their credit, the metal half of the industry has done a better job. But in the polymer world, this flat out doesn't exist. And as you know, I have a degree in mechanical engineering, although everybody at B9 would tell you I am not the best engineer in our company by a long shot. But even I know if the one of the building blocks of the process can't be documented to perform the same way, why am I trying to scale anything?
Yeah.
And we have people and customers who said, well, the beauty of it is we can get 100 really cheap printers now and we can produce a ton of parts. I said, yes, you can. And what is your AQL sampling approach? Oh, well, we just have to inspect all the parts because we don't know which ones are going to be the same or not the same. Oh my gosh, no good manufacturing engineer would do that. And you guys are bringing that to the biotech space.
Well, I think, yes, I agree with everything you said, but I think what I'm gonna, add to that is, and everybody who's been in manufacturing understands, again, if you start small, but you don't have those tolerances, as you scale, it just goes like this. The differences get wider and wider. But what I would say, because we've been through that and it's what was available, we had to using a series of different printers from different companies, we wouldn't be where we are today, without a relationship with B9 and, bringing, the printer aspect and the tolerances, and again, it's all part of the uh, again the environment and the process that even allows us to do what we say we can do. But it's also allows us to not. AJ and Heather would say, and maybe you've heard them say this, well, we can go out and build a printer. But why in the heck would we go do that when we can work with V9 Creations and now we'll focus on something else that's important. And so it's our relationship with B9 and the printers that you provide and the advice that you provide in engineering mindset has helped us get to where we are today. And so we flat wouldn't be here if we had to rely on the printers that we had before.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Tom. And our team, I wouldn't have known enough to ask the questions we've just covered in this podcast if it wasn't for you and your crew. We love working with you guys, not just because you're in a city that has a great barbecue. That doesn't hurt, but that's not the only reason. Well, I'm curious. So I have driven the car for most of this conversation. I want to give you the opportunity. Tom, are there things that you think in a discussion about biotech, national resiliency, advanced manufacturing that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure the folks that consume this content get exposed to, that something I've missed you want to make sure we get in
Well,
the arena?
I think the challenge, again, being in Kansas City and being a life science company or a biotech company in Kansas City is a little bit unheard of. So biotech, and when people think about biotech, they think about Boston, they think about San Francisco in those areas, or maybe even they think about overseas. And one of the really important things for us as we gain a little bit of traction is, again, just getting the word out. And again, one of the challenges in the country as a whole, and it's actually incredible, the bio literacy in the United States is low and very low. And so I think that what I would say again from a national security standpoint, there has to be an educational process about that, the importance of it, why it's important for national security, why it's important for national resilience. And it's not hard. If I can pick it up, other people can pick it up. Again, I'm just a CPA, and all of a sudden I can talk biology a little bit. But I think that that's really important. And so for us, it's exposure. It's actually just beating that drum. You have to do it. If you have to tell somebody, if you want someone to understand or actually agree with you, you got to probably tell them 7 times. I think that's a little bit the standard. And so really what's helpful for us, and I think as industry as a whole, is just opportunities like this to talk about why it's important, and in particular why standards and additive manufacturing and just the processes are so important to the process, and just everybody just needs to keep beating that drum. And then I think if there's anybody that has any influence on the government side of things, it's don't go out and keep doing the same old thing. You're not going to catch up. It's You've got to approach it. You got to take a fundamentally different approach. And it's not again, probably not being objective about it. It's not a big risk to try this approach. You could do it very cost effectively. I mean, one of the things we haven't touched about, and it's also a theme about additive manufacturing. One of the promises of additive manufacturing is we can make through 3D printed hydrogel and the other aspects of additive manufacturing. You can make biotechnology extremely capital efficient in a way that it is not today. And so I think that's really important.
I'm glad you touched on that. And one of the other things that I appreciate about what the work you guys are doing is being willing to step into that space between the technology and the policy, because, our elected officials can't be experts at everything. And I know between the work that you're doing and AJ spends a lot of time trying to speak and educate as well, so that we can make smarter decisions. Our country, all of a sudden, I think in ways, maybe, everybody that has supply chain in their title probably never felt better about what they did than during COVID,
Yeah.
right? Because suddenly everybody you could go to a party and talk about supply chain with anybody there. It's probably the first time a supply chain engineer ever went to a party and struck up a conversation with an attractive young lady, and she actually wanted to hear about supply chain. Had to be during COVID. And you know, Now we're in this moment where advanced manufacturing and this concept of another thing I think honestly we should say thank you to. You always got to find the silver lining in something like COVID, but when when I look and I'm like, wow, Ford Motor Company can't make vehicles, GM can't make vehicles, Toyota can't make vehicles because they can't get chips. Of course, little old B9 Creations, trying to get what we need from our suppliers. If Ford Motor Company can't get it, certainly we weren't going to be able to get it. And I think it was a wake up call to our country that, wow, if somebody decided they wanted to turn off the spigot one day on some pretty critical technology, that would be bad. And we're here, you hear it around critical minerals, electronics. And so this concept of reshoring or nearshoring or friendly shoring, I've heard that term a few times, has become a hot topic. And here we are as technology and manufacturing guys suddenly, in the spotlight, if you want to use that term, trying to help our country figure out in a very, very complex, very, very rapidly changing global environment how to be self sufficient. Yes, you've got to have allies, but you just don't know what might break a supply chain. And so you don't have the luxury of assuming everyone around you will always have the ability and desire to supply you with anything.
So 80% of our pharmaceuticals are manufactured outside the US. And not
Mm,
only outside the US, but in countries that may not have a desire to send us those pharmaceuticals if they so chose to. And so we got a whole industry highly dependent on something. There's no reason that we should be. And
Yep.
again, I go back to, but don't sit there and try to replicate what they have. Build smarter, be more innovative, and you can de-risk this whole process if they again take it from a fundamentally biological approach, it from biology first standard and modular, deployable suites, basically manufacturing suites. And again, additive manufacturing goes a long ways to actually helping us do that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the same thing outside of biotech. We're not going to reshore all this manufacturing the way it was done 50 years ago when it started getting offshored. We've got to be smarter. And I loved you when you brought up the whole point around workforce, Tom, because I was having a conversation yesterday with the CEO of a large publicly traded company, and they happen to be in the utility industry. We were talking about the impact of AI on business. And he used the example he said, for our men and women who drive a truck and climb poles and fix things, AI is probably not going to go climb that pole, or, an Optimus robot probably isn't going to be climbing that pole doing that work in the next at least 5, 6, 7 years. Yet everybody that sits in the headquarters building, their job might change radically. And when we think about how to bring this production, I'm going to use the phrase production capability back to US shores, and what Tom just said about 80% of pharmaceuticals getting made out of the United States, if you or a loved one take medication every day, what Tom just said should scare you to death. in this unstable world that we live in. I shouldn't use that language. I'm not out to scare anyone, but I think understanding the gravity of the situation. And again, fortunately during COVID, it didn't get any worse than Ford couldn't sell F-150s. It wasn't grandma couldn't get her diabetes medication or your loved one couldn't get their heart medication. But I think we'd be naive to want to continue with that level of risk exposure. And I'm thankful we've got business and technology leaders like you and AJ and Heather and your team working on helping us solve that problem. Thank you so much, Tom, for taking time to talk with me today, and not just about the biotech side, but really about how we become self-sufficient from a production capacity standpoint. And wish you and your team the very best. I hope to get back to Kansas City and eat some more of that barbecue soon.
We'd love to have you. You have an open invitation. Appreciate the invitation today, and hopefully it was mildly interesting. I hope I didn't put anybody to sleep, but again, very much appreciate the opportunity, and always willing to talk about additive manufacturing, biotech, and in particular Ronawk. So again, appreciate the opportunity.
Outstanding. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
If there's one theme that ran through this conversation, it's this: you cannot scale what you cannot standardize. Biotech is moving from craft to manufacturing, and that shift has implications far beyond healthcare. Shon, I think that's where I want to start. When you all were talking about stats like 80% of pharma manufacturing is outsourced, it starts to change how you think about biotech as a national security issue.
It does, especially if you or a loved one takes a medication every day. These are things that we tend to not think about: where they're made, how they're made, what the implications of that are. But if you remember back to COVID, which nobody likes to do, but it can be a good teacher, and we think about when Ford Motor Company couldn't get chips to complete the construction of F-150s and ship pickup trucks, if that were to happen in the pharmaceutical world and you or your loved one couldn't get that blood pressure medication or whatever that prescription was, the implications would be far more drastic than someone getting a slightly delayed new pickup truck. So Tom's take on reshoring, which is a word we've heard used a lot, or nearshoring, and the capabilities that we're fundamentally lacking in the United States to even be able to do that, I think are both informing and encouraging, because it's not a small lift, but it's doable.
Absolutely. And what really struck you more in this conversation? There was an incredible, I'll call it scientific breakthrough here, but there's also this idea that the real unlock is making biology predictable and repeatable. And that's a parallel we've seen in our own industry.
For sure. And, if I had a nickel for every time that I have heard an additive manufacturing expert start to say, we've got to get this accepted by the production people. We've got to get the plant manager on board. We've got to get the, supply chain people on board. And then you hear someone who is literally an expert in biotech, who has helped take, multiple companies through scale up and successful exits, say that what's missing is standardization. What's missing is that we like to say the boring element. It was an eye-opener for me when I first started working with Tom and getting to know Ronawk, Heather, AJ, and that whole crew. When they tell me how much of that research happens in a, and you heard Tom talk about it, but this two-dimensional Petri dish, and then as they start to scale, it doesn't get into a living body where these cells can send signals and interact until you're in animal testing. And then in animal testing, it doesn't necessarily react like humans. All the work prior to that is a stack of two-dimensional Petri dishes. It was mind-boggling to me. And I think that's part of what made our partnership so interesting to them, is they invented a technology that could offer the potential to standardize something that was unstandardizable before. And it just so happens that B9 Creation's DNA around repeatability, process consistency, QA/QC toolset, all those things that we talk about over and over, allowed them to have security and confidence that this process ran the same every time. So as we think about, this scale up of capability that Tom referenced, from the, bioreactors themselves, all of that doesn't gain us a lot if we don't go back and, as Tom said, you can't standardize biology. You have to let biology be biology, but you can standardize how you manage it. So encouraging, exciting stuff.
Absolutely. However you look at it, the future of biotechnology, and really the future of American manufacturing, will belong to the organizations that can turn these breakthrough ideas into disciplined, repeatable production. You can follow us on Apple or Spotify podcasts, and you can watch this episode on YouTube at the Additive Advantage podcast. If you found value in today's conversation, a 5-star review on Apple or on Spotify really helps us continue the show. And make sure to follow us on LinkedIn so you don't miss any new episodes. Thanks for spending time with us. We'll see you next time.